Opening lines with a flexible knight offers players a variety of strategic avenues to explore central control and piece development, a truly adaptable start. Establishing central presence immediately, d5 challenges white's flexibility and seeks to dictate early pawn structure dynamics. Challenging black's central pawn instantly creates dynamic imbalances and territorial skirmishes across the board. Instantly conceding central space, the pawn pushes deep, creating a locked structure and a potential target for future queenside expansion. A forward pawn thrust aims to unlock lines and prepare development, though it concedes central space. Developing the knight here solidifies central control and prepares for further piece activity, a sound positional idea. Opening the d-file instantly offers counterplay, disrupting black's pawn structure. Reclaiming the pawn opens lines, but exposes your knight to immediate counterplay. Simplifying the position is often a sound idea when you have a development advantage, creating a cleaner path for your pieces. Recapturing the pawn, black immediately centralizes the queen, contesting control of the vital d4 square and preparing to develop pieces actively. Developing the knight here fights for central squares and prepares to castle, reinforcing white's structural integrity. Developing a pawn to c6 firmly supports the central d4 pawn and prepares potential queenside expansion, adding pawn structure resilience. Clearing the central path for the queen's bishop and aiming to bolster the pawn structure unlocks a more active central presence. Opening a central diagonal for the queen and bishop, this pawn push also boldly stakes a claim in the center, setting the stage for a dynamic pawn struggle. Developing the bishop here aims to control the central diagonal and prepare for castling, reinforcing white's queenside pawn structure. Retreating the queen here surrenders central space and allows white's pawns to dominate the board's core. Centering the bishop aims for diagonal control and prepares kingside castling. Developing the knight to f6 now aims to bolster the e5 pawn and prepare for kingside castling. Initiating castling clears the path for the rook and tucks the king away safely. Developing the bishop to its natural diagonal prepares castling and enhances control over the center. Securing the monarch from any potential diagonal threats adds a touch of prophylaxis. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount, tucking it away from the central fray. Unleashing the f-pawn aggressively aims to disrupt black's central pawn structure and open lines for white's pieces, potentially creating attacking chances. Yielding the center pawn strategically opens lines for black's pieces, potentially creating dynamic attacking chances. Reclaiming the central file with the rook opens up attacking chances and exerts pressure on black's position. Developing the bishop now connects the rooks and prepares to challenge the d3 pawn, but it also blocks the queen's view of the f4 rook. Opening the d-file now seeks to exploit the central pawn structure and activate the queen. Reconnecting the queen to the queen side, the dark-squared bishop now faces immense pressure from white's advanced pawn. Gaining central space and preparing for a potential kingside attack, the bishop now eyes the queenside castled king. Challenging white's central grip, this bishop eyes the king's sanctuary and aims to disrupt harmony. Repositioning the queen clears the d-file for the rook and prepares for potential central pawn breaks, enhancing piece activity. Developing the bishop to the long diagonal immediately intensifies the pressure on white's d4 pawn. Shifting the bishop to f5 aims to disrupt black's queen and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares around the king. Retreating the queen to c7 unwinds the tangled pawn structure, offering some breathing room. Targeting the center with aggressive rook activity on the open file promises greater influence. Retreating the bishop now frees the queenside, potentially preparing for a queenside advance, but it does leave the kingside a bit less defended against white's central pawns. Unleashing the rook aggressively, though it potentially exposes itself to counterplay on the h-file. Reclaiming the e-file's central influence, this maneuver prepares for potential pawn pushes and solidifies the kingside's defense. Suddenly opening the bishop's diagonal offers immediate tactical possibilities, potentially disrupting black's pawn structure and creating pressure. Recapturing the queen offers little activity and allows white to solidify their central presence. Discarding the active bishop unlocks a powerful kingside assault, strategically simplifying the battlefield for future pawn advances. Doubling pawns opens the f-file for your rook, but weakens your king's defenses considerably. Securing that rook's return allows for a more cohesive defense and prepares to contest open files. The queen retreats, seeking a safer haven, but leaves the kingside slightly vulnerable to further pressure. A preemptive step to secure the queenside pawn structure and potentially open a pathway for the b-pawn. Reinforcing the d-file is crucial now, as that central artery feels quite contested. Securing the d-file with the rook allows white to contest it, preparing for potential central pawn advances or a squeeze on black's king. Reclaiming the queen's mobility after the rook's repositioning seems a bit passive here, given the open d-file. Unlocking the central pawn chain cracks open lines, creating dynamic play and potentially weakening black's king's safety. Opening the c-file creates immediate pressure and tests black's pawn structure, potentially leading to a dynamic imbalance. Capturing the pawn decisively opens the c-file, aiming to exploit weaknesses and activate your rooks. A bold attempt to reclaim central influence, but it surrenders crucial diagonal control and invites further pawn advances. A calculated realignment to solidify the d-file and potentially reroute the rook to a more active post, aiming to disrupt black's piece coordination. Repositioning the bishop to d6 aims to bolster the pawn chain and challenge white's control of the central files. Reinforcing the kingside pawn structure aims to prevent black's pieces from infiltrating. Securing the kingside pawn chain stability becomes the priority with this defensive adjustment. Shattering the pawn chain opens lines, but b2 now guards a lonely king. Reclaiming the central pawn offers a chance to untangle black's pieces and contest the open files. Reactivating the rook to the central files injects much-needed life into white's cramped position. Recapturing the rook opens the e-file, creating immediate attacking prospects for white's queen and bishop. Securing the central pawn majority and opening lines for the queen's influence. A patient pawn advance to prevent white's queenside expansion. The queen repositions, bolstering pawn chains and preparing to contest the critical central squares with newfound liberty. Venturing the knight to the edge, an attempt to redeploy towards the kingside or potentially create pressure on the queenside outpost. Initiating the rook's activation along the open e-file opens up new attacking avenues. Unleashing a knight fork, this check aims to disrupt white's king's safety and potentially win material, creating immediate tactical complications. Securing the monarch's escape route after the knight's daring sortie is paramount to avoid further disruption. Shifting the rook to the open file ignites the initiative and prepares for a powerful pawn push. Preparing to regain the initiative by redeploying the queen to a more active diagonal, potentially threatening the isolated pawns. Embracing the open diagonal, black's king cautiously retreats, preparing for defensive maneuvers in the coming exchanges. Reclaiming the central outpost and preparing to expand on the kingside. Accepting the knight exchange simplifies things, potentially heading towards an endgame where your queen can become more active. Recapturing on e4 reestablishes piece presence and opens avenues for counterplay on the kingside. Reactivating the rook's power along the f-file now puts pressure on white's weakened central pawns. Asserting dominance on the d-file, white prepares to challenge black's vulnerable queen. Reactivating the f-file offers a new avenue of attack, while also defending the vulnerable knight. Gaining central space and threatening the queenside is a key objective now. Exchanging queens here solidifies black's central pawn majority, though it also initiates an endgame where white has slightly better pawn structure. Clearing the path for the rook to actively patrol the queenside after the pawn exchange. Bringing the rook to the d-file prepares to contest it, aiming to exploit white's isolated pawn. Shifting the king offers a new avenue of activity for the monarch in this simplified endgame. Preparing to defend the weak pawn chain on the queen side and potentially activate the rook on a less passive file. King's march begins, aiming to activate the monarch for the endgame. Securing the king and preparing for the inevitable pawn endgame becomes paramount now. A timely check aims to disrupt black's king's safety and force further pawn exchanges. A bold attempt to activate the rook, but it might be overextending and exposing itself unnecessarily. Simplifying the position through this exchange streamlines white's path towards activity in the central files. This pawn move immediately surrenders the central dark squares to white's control, creating permanent weaknesses in black's structure. Solidifying pawn structure anticipates potential weaknesses as the endgame unfolds. This pawn push opens a clear path for your king to become more active and participate in the unfolding endgame. Advancing the pawn now will help secure the kingside territory. Shifting the king towards the center begins to activate it for the endgame skirmish. Pawn structure now dictates the king's march towards the center to participate in the fight for control. Strengthening the queenside pawn chain establishes a defensive bulwark against potential royal advances. Opening up the H-file now could be a double-edged sword, potentially creating weaknesses around your own monarch. Opening the G-file creates significant king exposure, a dangerous gamble in this simplified board. This pawn break finally opens the G-file, creating immediate attacking chances for white's kingside pawns. Challenging the queenside pawn structure opens up the file for potential counterplay. Capturing the pawn opens the G-file, creating potential threats against the black king. The pawn grab opens a path for the king, though it might lead to a complex pawn structure that requires careful maneuvering. Capturing the pawn consolidates the space advantage, pushing the king towards the critical central squares. Retrieving the pawn now initiates a race to consolidate the remaining material, a pivotal moment in this endgame's fate. Reactivating the king opens lines for attack, aiming to control the central squares now that exchanges have simplified the position. Securing the king's path to the center is paramount in this drawn-out endgame. The white king now decisively asserts its presence, transforming the game into a race against the black king's slower advance. Securing the king's safety is paramount, as white's pawn structure crumbles under the relentless pressure. Solidifying the pawn structure prevents black's king from finding an active post. Securing the king's potential escape route is paramount in this pawn-down endgame. Seeking to utilize the open files and expose black's king, white advances his monarch aggressively towards the center. The king's journey towards the center is paramount now, aiming to participate actively in the unfolding endgame. The king steps forward, initiating the decisive push for control of the central squares. The king's flight path is now critically exposed. Immediate defensive repositioning is paramount. The monarch ventures into the center, seeking new hunting grounds while black's king remains hemmed in on the side. King's daring excursion into enemy territory ignites a swift endgame confrontation, demanding precise calculation. The monarch ventures to the center, initiating the final pawn push to achieve queenside material advantage. The king boldly strides forward, seeking active participation in the decisive phase of this endgame. King's march toward the center demands black's careful attention to pawn structure. Seizing the open file allows the king to infiltrate and hunt down the remaining pawns. King's march to the queen side initiates a swift pawn grab, aiming to simplify into a clear winning material advantage. This pawn advance solidifies the king's escape route while preparing to escort the passed b-pawn for promotion. Securing the weak queenside pawns prevents any further black counterplay, aiming for a decisive king hunt. King venturing to the center now, seeking activity and a chance to support the pawns before white's king infiltrates further. Simplifying to a known winning material advantage, white locks down the queenside and prepares a swift invasion. This maneuver finally activates the monarch, seeking respite from the pawn chains. The white king scrambles towards the queenside, aiming to corner the remaining black pawns with its newfound mobility.